says it is to form over Riyadh, our minister region. We're going to learn more, if we can, about what happened with the Israeli attack on the Iranian part of the South Pars gas field. What do we know? What do we understand? We've certainly heard from the US president. Anything from the Israeli side?
Becky, before we saw President Donald Trump's response, we had heard from 2 Israeli officials that the attack was coordinated with the United States. And that, of course, is no surprise. Since the very first opening strikes nearly 3 weeks ago now, Israel and the U.S. have been coordinated on nearly every aspect of this. And that's not only a testament to the relationship between the U.S. and Israel at the political and military levels, it's also simply necessary to carry out these attacks with so many moving parts in the air, and in the sea all at once. So Israeli officials say the attack on the South Pars gas field was coordinated with the U.S., and it was intentionally targeted at gas and electricity infrastructure, not at oil infrastructure, to insulate the attacks and the price of fuel in the United States from Israel's ongoing attacks. Of course, that didn't work when Iran lashed out and attacked gas and oil infrastructure around the region. But everything we have heard from the Israelis, and we heard it again from a foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu last night on Jake Tapper's show, is that all of this has been coordinated with the U.S. And we've heard that from the U.S. side as well, both political and military. So, Becky, at this point, I think it's very difficult to believe Trump's claim that the U.S. and he knew nothing about the attack on the South Pars gas field because of the coordination we have seen to this very point. The idea that 3 weeks into a war that Israel wants to continue, that Israel would just simply go rogue and carry out attacks that are not coordinated with the U.S. is incredibly hard to believe right now.
What else do we know about the long list of targets that we understand Israel has at this point? They were, it seems, targeted at individuals and groups inside of Iran. I'm just wondering whether this long list includes other installations outside of Tehran and the sort of, the neighborhoods.
My teeth were falling to pieces and I needed a fresh start and I needed to be able to smile and laugh without covering my face.
That answer is almost certainly. They're not going to give us a target list of what's remaining just yet, but we have seen them expand where they are striking. Yesterday, they acknowledged striking on Iran's northern border. Their first strikes, they say, in northern Iran. Israeli officials tell us they hit Iranian naval assets in the Caspian Sea, which is, again, the first time we've seen that since the war. There are also almost certainly more targeted killings that Israel is planning to carry out, including against Mujtaba Khamenei and others. So that list certainly has more targets on it, Becky, as the war continues.
So what do you make of this apparent split between the U.S. and Israel, with President Trump in a rare rebuke of Israel saying the U.S. knew nothing about the strike on a key Iranian gas field after Iranian state media blamed both the U.S. and Israel, and President Trump calling on Israel to end all strikes on energy targets?
Now, my thinking about that is that President Trump has made a political analysis, and that is that the greatest vulnerability we in the United States, and especially the world, as your previous commentators have made mention, is vulnerability in the energy sector. So that particular political pressure, both domestic and foreign, is felt by President Trump. And what he saw was an attack. Perhaps we don't know this for certain, but certainly initiated by Israel. Whether or not Israel had any previous approval or at least giving alerts to the United States, doubtful, nobody knows. But that hit energy. And if there is anything that President Trump does not want to happen, that is a political downslide as a result of an uproar both in the United States and around the world about the desperate circumstances that are resulting from the, quite frankly, the embargo of fossil fuels, natural gas, petroleum, bottled up down there at the Straits of Hormuz.
Could this signal the U.S. stepping back a little bit here?
I am an optimistic person, so perhaps again I'm not one of these who have, I mean, optimism hasn't pushed me to the point in which I would embrace the expectation that this war will end in another week to 2 weeks. And that's because we use an expression in the military: the enemy has a vote. And what that means, quite simply, is we can have all the best plans in the world. We can establish our objectives, limited or broader, but we are in a conflict with a regime that has a long history grounded in religious fanaticism. It is not so simple to encourage the Iranian leadership to abandon what, from its perspective, is an existential conflict, meaning Iran, from the date of its formation in 1979, has dedicated itself to self-preservation and directly, and has expressed very clearly, destruction of Israel and the implementation or imposition of huge pain on the United States. I don't see the Iranians necessarily backing down, regardless of what President Trump has done vis-a-vis Israel and the bombing of the South Paws oil fields.
So what about boots on the ground? A U.S. military ship with almost 2,500 military personnel on board is heading to the region. And according to Reuters, the Trump administration is considering sending thousands more. Now, we don't know exactly what they'll be doing, but there is talk of them getting troops to extract Iran's enriched uranium, or possibly sending them to Karg Island. How risky would these ground operations be?
First way to answer that question is to incorporate what you have described as two objectives of U.S. land forces. One is securing the uranium that is buried across Iran, locations not necessarily well known. That is a very difficult task because you're putting American soldiers in harm's way deep inside the country, and that becomes a real fight on the ground. The second use of American soldiers, at least from my perspective, is to establish some sort of enclave around the Straits of Hormuz. That is the area of vulnerability. That particular geographic location and the utilization of that location by the Iranians, has caused what we see of the great pain now suffered around the world. So you get ground troops and you establish a beachhead around the Straits of Hormuz for the purpose of, one, locating additional ground to ship weapons, as well as Iranian forces, naval assets that constitute the threat to shipping. So there are two, as you've recited, two potential locations for the imposition of U.S. forces, both extremely dangerous. We don't know what will happen.
Right. Retired Major General Mark McCarley, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
The pennies dropped. Pay a low flat fee and keep the money you make. Interactive Investor. I think, therefore I.
I used to think that love was just a fairy tale. I wouldn't change a thing, 'cause this love is everlasting. Suddenly.
John, why don't we start with the events overnight? I've got in front of me that statement that Donald Trump put out this morning. I won't read it all, it's very long, but expressing shock and dismay and not really knowing about an attack by Israel, or not knowing in advance about an attack by Israel on Iran, on a particular oil installation in Iran, trying to distance himself from it. What did you interpret from that?
I'm sorry, but I cannot believe for a second
That he didn't know.
That he didn't know. The idea, you've got joint control of the skies over Iran between the Israelis and the Americans. You are coordinating the whole time. Everything over what you're doing and where and how, with what munitions. The idea that Israel would unilaterally attack the South Pars gas field in Iran without America knowing, to me, seems utterly inconceivable. What happened after that was that Qatar, who jointly kind of run this field, get on the phone and to Steve Witkoff, Trump's negotiator, and say, what on earth is going on? How could this have possibly happened? Trump thinks, I better distance myself from this, issues a statement saying, I knew nothing about it. It will never happen again. Look, we know that Donald Trump can be slightly untethered from the truth. Let me put it gently like that. You know, he invented a complete story at his news conference on Monday that was just totally made up about something that had happened, you know, in 2000. So Donald Trump has the capacity not to tell the whole truth. It seems to me incredible, in the literal use of the word incredible. It seems incredible that Israel would have dared do something like this without America's buy-in in advance through Central Command. Now, is it conceivable that this happened without Donald Trump having been told personally? I guess that's possible. But the idea that Israel would do it without Central Command, which is the US kind of nerve center of all of this, knowing, no, don't
Not
buy
possible. Well, we also know that America, so not Israel this time, America yesterday attacked missile installations and other military installations on the edges of Hormuz in order to secure Hormuz, was the idea behind that. So this is really, I mean, I know there are other points in this war, but this is where the action really is now, isn't it? Energy installations and shipping.
Well, it's like there are two different wars going on. There is the war that America says, and Israel says it is winning, and in terms of the degrading of the Iranian military infrastructure, leadership, absolutely true. Israel and the US have total control over the skies above Iran. But how can Donald Trump say that we're winning and got a victory imminently when the Strait of Hormuz is shut, when oil and gas installations across the Gulf are being attacked still by Iran in targeted strikes on oil depots, on gas fields, in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar? The Strait of Hormuz is anywhere closer to being opened. And, you know, I've seen there's a joint statement being issued by Keir Starmer and others, so other European leaders, so the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Japan. And there's a really interesting final paragraph, which, let me just read it. We express our readiness to contribute to appropriate efforts to ensure safe passage through the strait. We welcome the commitment of nations who are engaging in preparatory planning. I mean, it says a lot, and it says absolutely nothing.
And it harks back, I think, to what Keir Starmer was saying at the beginning of the week when he was explaining why he didn't support the joining the attacks on Hormuz. But he did say then, and then that statement has added to it, we're in conversation with other countries, with other allies, Do you think something will come of that? Or is that a real flim-flam, bureaucratic holding paragraph?
You've got the basic problem that, you know, are we going to send a warship to escort a tanker through the Strait of Hormuz? Not a chance at the moment, because you are so vulnerable to attack, whether from Iranian missiles or whether through a mine that's been thrown overboard from some dhow or, you know, fishing boat that happens to be in the strait. Iran doesn't need a sophisticated navy to place a chokehold around the Strait of Hormuz. It is highly dangerous.
I was hearing somebody say the other day on radio that someone in a rib with a bomb could do it.
Just easily. It's the easiest thing in the world. And apparently Iran has got 5,000 sea mines. It's a very narrow stretch of water that you're going through. America, with the second most powerful navy in the world, hasn't dared put a warship into the Strait of Hormuz. The other thing that I heard today was Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, talking about how America could retake Kharg Island. Now, Kharg Island is the center of Iranian oil operations. That's where all their exports go from.
It's just on the edge of Hormuz, isn't it?
Yeah. But how? How are America going to take it? What, are they going to send in Marines? Are there going to be paratroopers landing on the island, and suddenly they're going to be hoisting a stars and stripes over the island? If you're going to do this, you're going to need, it would seem, you know, I'm not a military planner and I'm not a military historian, but everything I've read, says you would need to put troops on the ground to be fighting almost hand-to-hand combat with Iranian forces if that is what you want to do, because it is so easy to close off the Strait of Hormuz.
And it's interesting, the degree to which they have hobbled Iran militarily or not is a big question, isn't it? Because, I mean, we know they have in the skies, we know they've damaged all the ships, but in the military spokesperson in that Hegseth press conference talked about Iran still having substantial military power, weakened, yes, but still there. And Iran's foreign minister has said we used a fraction of our power on the attack on Qatar's Ras Laffan energy complex. So they've got more in the tank, is what they're saying.
Exactly. And
they will have.
So the threat that Iran poses right now hasn't gone away. They have shown just how intensely dangerous they still remain. So, if you go back to that question that I posed a moment ago, who is winning this war at the moment? And at the moment, the energy prices are going through the roof. The West is shuddering at the prospect of what might happen. In Asia,
and putting out statements like that one, which doesn't take us anywhere.
Doesn't take us anywhere. But in the meantime, people are talking about fuel rationing. Sheila, you and I suspect, are old enough to remember the oil shock at the end of 1973 after the Yom Kippur War, where we're doing our homework.
Candles at dinner.
Exactly. And the idea that here we are in 2026 and we could be going through something similar seems fanciful, but airlines are talking about cancelling flights because of a shortage of aviation fuel. And so it goes on. Across Asia, some countries are going on to a 4-day week. In Thailand, they've been told to turn off air conditioning. There is a real fuel shortage now across the world because of what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran seems to hold all the aces at the moment.
And I don't doubt conversations are taking place. Well, I would hope they're taking place in government, but we still haven't really had an answer, have we, to questions that began at the beginning of the week. Former advisor to Downing Street saying we should be looking at rationing of oil, rationing of petrol.
I think that, these things start very slowly and then suddenly, whoosh, we're engulfed in this. And, maybe the comparison is when COVID started and we were hearing kind of these cases in faraway countries, and suddenly Britain is in lockdown. Now, I'm not suggesting that we are going through something like that, but if this continues,
snowball very quickly.
It can snowball very quickly.
Can I ask you to take us, with your experience in Washington and North America, take us into the US psyche, the US citizen psyche on all of this? Because you've got Hegseth saying there, £200 billion of dollars, I should say, of taxpayer money to go to the US military to sustain this and other activities, no doubt. And you've got the pumps, the car, the American relationship with the car. How risky is this now for Donald Trump come November?
Can I just disentangle a couple of bits of that? The $200 billion, I think, is really fascinating, because that is more than America has spent in Ukraine, in helping Ukraine, and that was 4 years ago. So that is more than 4 years of expenditure. Now, it's not that America has spent $200 billion over the past 2.5 weeks, but what it suggests is that America thinks it's in for a long haul here. That America thinks that, Hegseth and the Pentagon think this is going to go on for some time to come yet. So kind of the dream that we all had, that there was this off-ramp by which there'd be some cobbled together kind of peace, and, after 2.5 weeks of bombing, it would all stop. I don't think that's the case. I think that America is thinking this might go on for some time because, as the military commander was saying, Iran still has a sizable arsenal of weapons that it can fire. And then you get onto domestic opinion. I think there are two strands to this. The first strand is, what if ground troops go in to Iran and try and retake the Strait of Hormuz by force? I think there is very, very little support for that. I think the latest poll I saw was 68% of Americans would oppose it. This all comes in a year when you've... So even the base, even Republicans are split 50-50 on that. So you haven't got support there for Donald Trump on that. And of course, Donald Trump, prior to this war in Iraq with Iran, was facing a crisis of affordability, where Democrats were making big gains and making a lot of political hay by saying America has become unaffordable because of your tariffs policy. We'll throw into that mix what's going to happen to fuel prices, but then the knock-on that has on supply chains, and so food prices go up or clothing prices go up, and all those things and Americans start getting hit hard, it's going to be a tough message for Donald Trump to say this is a price worth paying when Donald Trump had promised there would be no more wars.
And a word on Joe Kent, actually, you take me there with your last comment. He gave a long interview to Tucker Carlson yesterday on Carlson's podcast, in which he reiterated and elaborated on the comments he'd already made. And he's saying there is no justification for this war. There was no imminent threat. And he's really doubled down on that, hasn't he?
And this is the split. I mean, it's tempting to think of Joe Kent as some kind of, Robin Cook figure at the time of the invasion of Iraq, as sort of some kind of pacifist. No, he is, Joe Kent is a very political figure, and he's on the MAGA right. He's on the right of kind of the coalition of Trump supporters. But there is an important kind of area of opinion.
But it was his job to know if there was justification,
yes,
and he's saying there isn't.
There wasn't. And there are so many people who think like that in America now, who think, well, hang on, you haven't made the case. There was no imminent threat. What was the imminent threat to America and its interests in Iran 2.5 weeks ago that has gone today?
We want to start tonight with a clip from January of 2024. This is from this show, and this is Joe Kent, who later went on to become, until yesterday, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Here it is.
What do you think the immediate and then longer term effects of a war with Iran would be on the United States?
Immediately, it would be very bloody. I have no doubt that we could probably defeat some of their air defense and go in there and have another shock and awe campaign. But again, like we saw how the shock and awe campaign in Iraq really didn't actually work in the long run. So I have no doubt that we'd have some immediate results that people would cheer about here in the United States. But Iran, Persia, has always been an empire. It's been around longer than any of the other players in the modern Middle East right now, and they are not going anywhere. If we get deeply involved and deeply entangled with Iran, we are playing right into China's hands, because China would like nothing more than for us to be committing our military industrial base to a war in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, and then to be committing our conventional military power, our blood and our treasure, back in the Middle East. That will make the Pacific, our actual border, extremely vulnerable to Chinese aggression, or China will simply just watch us bleed out economically as we bleed out on the battlefield on these couple different theaters. It's absolute insanity. It's opening up Pandora's box. And again, for what gain to the American people?
So the very first thing you notice about that clip, which was shot almost exactly a year before the current president was inaugurated, is that it was right. It was prescient. He called it. He called the general outline. Not that it was hard to call, but Joe Kent knows what he's talking about. He spent a lot of his life in that region, and he said a year before this current presidency began, this is a big, serious country. It's the oldest civilization in the region, and if we went to war with Iran, there would be a momentary sugar high. Americans would support it because they support their own country, and they certainly support their military, and people would approve of it. But very quickly, you could see a process by which we got caught there, trapped there, bear trap. Hard to extricate yourself from that. And sitting on the sidelines would be our chief global competitor, China, who would be silently nodding along with a slowly spreading grin, knowing that they were the main beneficiary of what they were seeing, of our waste of American lives and treasure, as Joe Kent said. So we haven't reached that stage, thankfully. We're moving toward it, and everyone who's watching carefully knows that. And if you're honest, you know that. So this is a very serious moment we're in, and we're watching not just a war in Iran, but potentially a total realignment of the world and the loss, in some sense, of what the United States has globally. This could be the beginning of the end of our influence in a lot of the world, and that's just the beginning. So again, that's a big deal. It's starting to dawn on people, and that leaves Joe Kent as one of the relatively few people connected to this administration who said it in public. Is that good or bad? Well, it may seem good. Of course, you want to be around people who have clarity about what's going to happen next. But in practical terms, it's bad. In fact, it's always bad. Whenever you have somebody who stands up and says, don't do this, here's what could happen, and then you do it anyway, and it turns out that person was right, your first instinct is not to apologize and correct your behavior. Your first instinct is to crush the person who called it correctly. And that's your instinct because, and it's the lowest of all instincts, but it's a human instinct. That's your instinct because his correct prediction is an indictment of you, of course. And it's a way to deflect attacks on you and your own culpability by blaming the guy who told you it was going to happen before you did it. And this is a long-standing fact of human life. And in the last 60 years in this country, it has been the iron law of foreign policy, which is to say, when things go wrong, the only people who get punished are the people who criticize the adventure in the first place. You can imagine General Westmoreland attacking Walter Cronkite of CBS News. Whenever you think of Walter Cronkite, in my case, not much. But fundamentally, it was Walter Cronkite sitting very much on the sidelines saying, hey, this war's not going well. And there was General Westmoreland prosecuting the war. But General Westmoreland argued till the end of his life, in some ways successfully, that he lost the war because Walter Cronkite criticized the war. Is that really true? How many troops did Walter Cronkite command? Was he in charge of strategy? Don't think so. He was a newsreader in New York. But you can see why Westmoreland did that, why a lot of people believed it, agreed with Westmoreland. You saw the same thing happen in the days after the tragic and incredibly stupid Afghan withdrawal under Joe Biden. That didn't help the United States. Of course, we had to get out of Afghanistan, but the way we did it, who would argue that was a good thing? It was a terrible thing and resulted in the deaths of a lot of Americans. So who was punished for that? As far as we can tell, and we've checked, only one person. And that would be Colonel Stu Scheller of the United States Marine Corps. What was his crime? Planning the withdrawal from Afghanistan? Oh, no. No, Stu Scheller's crime was saying out loud, boy, that didn't work very well. And why'd we do this? And for that, he went to jail. The people who actually did it, who gave the orders or who carried them out without asking questions about them, which was everybody else, they're fine. You don't even know their names, and they certainly haven't been penalized. So there is a long history, because this is a standing feature of the way people are, that you criticize those who told the truth and who were right, who called it ahead of time. Now, in a functioning society, you get a hold of yourself, and you understand that people are like this, but if you want to be successful as a society, you have to restrain that impulse because it's low and it's counterproductive. And if you silence people who tell the truth, you end up making the same mistakes again and again and again. And maybe
Donald Trump has threatened to blow up the entirety of Iran's South Pars gas field if Tehran strikes Qatar's gas infrastructure again. In a post on Truth Social, the president said the US knew nothing about an Israeli strike on the South Pars gas field, the biggest natural gas field in the world, which then sparked attacks by Iran on Qatar's Ras Laffan facility, the world's largest gas hub. He said if Iran attacks that hub again, the US will massively blow up the entirety of the South Pars gas field at an amount of strength and power that Iran has never seen before. But shortly before the post, Iranian state television reported that they had struck the Ras Laffan complex for a second time. Qatar Energy confirmed the facility sustained further significant damage. These here are pictures of the aftermath of the initial strikes. Huge fires could be seen from more than 30 kilometers away. Iran said it targeted the facility and others in the region in response to the Israeli strikes on its own facilities at the South Pars gas reservoir. Oil prices have leapt as a result, up 5%. Our North America correspondent Peter Bowes analysed the president's Truth Social post.
It is quite a lengthy Truth Social post, and I think it's worth, Sally, going through some of it in detail, because I think it tells us quite a lot about the current mood of the president. He says Israel had violently lashed out at the South Pars gas field, which, as you said, is one of the world's largest natural gas fields. He says lashed out of anger for what has taken place in the Middle East. The United States, he insists, knew nothing about it. He says Qatar wasn't involved either. And then he goes on, unfortunately, the Iran did not know this, and unjustifiably, he says, and unfairly attacked a portion of Qatar's LNG, liquefied natural gas facility. This is a major facility. We know that it was extensively damaged. And then in capital letters, President Trump says no more attacks will be made by Israel related to the Iranian gas fields unless, and there is a caveat, he says, unless Tehran decides to strike Qatar again. And he says if that happens, and this is where the president uses his strongest language, he says the US wouldn't hesitate to launch a massive retaliatory attack, massively blow up, to use the president's words, the entire Iranian gas field at an amount of strength and power that Iran, he says, has never seen or witnessed before. He then goes on to say he's reluctant to do this because he knows that there will be long-term implications for the future of Iran.
Well, let's go live to our business hub in Singapore and speak to our Asia business correspondent, Nick Marsh. Nick, just how sharp are these oil spikes that we're seeing at the moment?
Well, they're the sharpest that we've seen in quite a few days, Catherine. Just looking now, the price of a barrel of Brent crude, which is one of the benchmark measurements for oil, is at $113. Anything above 100, Catherine, is very, very high indeed. If you think that in quote unquote normal circumstances, and that's all very relative, isn't it? A barrel of oil might be traded for about $70, $80, maybe even in the 60s. You know, if there aren't any big demand, you can see how much it's gone up, and it's been above $100 for quite some time now. The reason is because of, firstly, the blockage in the Strait of Hormuz that we've been talking about so much. Iran effectively controls that narrow passageway. It's attacking ships, and if things can't get through, so you know, millions of barrels of oil and gas, for example, then the supply is going to be constrained and prices are going to go up. But now, as we've just been hearing, there have been some pretty serious attacks on incredibly important gas fields, and even Donald Trump having to weigh in there to try and, okay, he threatened, but almost de-escalate a little bit, saying Israel won't do it again. When the infrastructure is hit and the passageways are hit, supply really takes a hit, and it's mostly here in Asia. You know, Asia are the big customers for oil and gas that comes through the Strait of Hormuz. When the price of oil and gas is high, the price of everything becomes high, because then it affects transportation, it affects manufacturing, petrol, even plastics. I was reading about in China today, for example. So $113 is very high indeed.
Nick, thank you. That's our correspondent, Nick Marsh in Singapore there. Well, let's go live to Dubai and speak to our correspondent there, Azadeh Moshiri. Hello, Azadeh. Just tell us about the impact of these strikes, both by Israel and Iran, on these energy facilities.
Well, Qatar, as well as the UAE and other countries, knew that they could be on the front line of Iran's fury, retaliatory attacks following the Israeli strikes at South Pars. And Qatar has seen its Rafah energy facility targeted multiple times. Fires are now under control, according to Qatar. And here in the UAE, there was damage to some gas fields due to debris from intercepted attacks. And you can imagine that there's a lot of anger about these strikes and these Iranian attacks, so much so that following a meeting of foreign affairs ministers in the capital of Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, there has been a joint statement that has been issued by a group of Arab nations and Islamic countries. So not only Qatar, UAE, and others that you might expect, but also countries like Pakistan, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan was part of that group as well. And they've condemned these attacks by Iran, reserved their right to self-defense, and they've urged Iran to halt these attacks immediately. They've also asserted they've also shown support for Lebanon and have condemned what they've called Israel's expansionist behavior in the region. Now, it's worth remembering that the reason these countries, particularly in the Gulf, are so taken aback isn't just that Iran is targeting them because of their ties with the United States. They feel like they've really been pulled into this war unjustly because of the fact that some of them, Oman, of course, in particular, have played mediating roles between Iran and the West in the past. And so the consequences of this in the long term are very significant. Multiple countries have said if Iran thought this was pushing these countries to urge the United States to end the war and end it now, they've miscalculated, that instead Gulf countries are enraged and they believe, and they've said that that relationship with Iran, one that in some ways Iran has depended on amidst all these sanctions, amidst all these conflicts, that relationship has been damaged for decades to come.
Was Iran on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon?
No, they weren't, 3 weeks ago when this started, and they weren't in June either.
The president's former top counterterror official is doubling down on claims he made in his resignation letter yesterday, where he argued Iran posed no imminent threat to the United States. Now the administration disputes the president's ear before the war began. Kent has said some voices within the administration were shut out from the decision making.
A good deal of key decision makers were not allowed to come express their opinion to the president. There was robust debate and robust discussions leading up to the 12-day war into Midnight Hammer. But the second round, to me, and I'm sure others will refute this and disagree with me, but what was conducted by just a handful of small of advisors around the president.
Joining me now, former advisor to Vice President Mike Pence and Homeland Security Advisor during Trump's first term, Olivia Troy. She also worked at the National Counterterrorism Center. Also here, former senior communications aide Lindsey Graham and Mike Pompeo, T.W. Origi. Glad to have both of you here. I'll begin with you, Olivia, because you resigned from the first Trump administration. And I wonder if you're surprised by Kent's comments that key decision makers, that's his phrase, could not voice their opinions to Trump.
I found that interesting. I think, to me, this is kind of classic Trump circles, the way it works when you're making important decisions. Sometimes people are in the room, sometimes get excluded out of the room, depending on who's pushing what viewpoint. And what opinion or follow-up, viewpoint they want. So to hear someone like that say that on who wasn't in the room when you're making such a critically important decision on whether you're going to engage in conflict, global conflict, to me, that's appalling, because you would think that you would want all the voices in the room to really debate such an issue and inform the president on all of the options and the repercussions of certain actions that you're going to take.
That's the point of a cabinet. Whether he takes the advice is a different story as commander in chief. But I want to play more of what Kent is claiming about whether this indeed was an imminent threat. Listen.
There was no intelligence that said, hey, on whatever day it was, March 1st, the Iranians are going to launch this big sneak attack. They're going to do some kind of a 9/11 at Pearl Harbor, et cetera. They're going to attack one of our bases. There was none of that intelligence. Again, back to what we know about the Iranians, they're very, very deliberate with the escalation ladder. And again, they're only deliberate under President Trump's leadership because they knew and they took President Trump very, very seriously.
Do you see this as his claims directly undermining what the administration has said?
I don't know. Look, Joe Kent is a combat veteran. He has earned the right to speak freely, and he can resign if he wants. That is fine. But as the previous guest pointed out, the Iranian threat has always been imminent. They act on it all the time. And I'm not really sure in the phraseology. This is, by the way, a gentleman who advocated for taking out their nuclear sites and their missile depots, who advocated this when he was running for office. But I quarrel with the idea of what does an imminent nuclear threat look like? Are we waiting for the bomb to be on the launcher before we decide to take action? The fact of the matter is Steve Witkoff was told directly by the Iranians that they had 1,000 pounds or more, 400 something kilograms of enriched uranium that were a hint away from being able to be put on a weapon, and that they had the inalienable right to enrich uranium. So the fact of the matter is, this is a president who has made decisive action to bring Iran to its weakest point, to disrupt its proxies, to bring the Gulf states into a coalition with the Abraham Accords, and to bring the Middle East to a new chapter. This was absolutely the right time to act. And I'm sort of surprised that Joe Kent doesn't have the foresight to see that.
And yet, according to the headline, every single day of the Trump administration would have been a day that he could have proclaimed imminence. Even after last year, we were told that it had been obliterated in terms of the ability to have, at least in the short term, to have that nuclear capability. But this idea of having dissenting voices or who could provide alternate information, I mean alternate facts, I mean information of the intelligence community. Olivia, I mean, Trump has been quick to dismiss him, saying that he wasn't smart, he wasn't savvy, for not believing that Iran posed a threat. But you'll notice that Kent has been very careful to avoid personally attacking Trump, which I found interesting. Listen.
Imagine being able to build anything just by thinking about it. Meet Base 44, a complete AI creation platform made for anyone with an idea. And
I think we departed personally on good terms. Again, I'm an adult. I understand the way I left and writing the letter that there's parts of his administration that are going to have to come after me and try and discredit me. I understand that. But I think the president is someone who listens.
Yet he's just talking about, I think you have a very unique perspective in terms of somebody who has voiced and been vocal about things you disagree with in an administration like this. How do you think the MAGA world will see him in this interview?
Well, you know, I think it's part of serving in the Trump administration when you have an opposing view and you're worried about voicing it because you're going to be shown the door. I mean, we saw Tulsi Gabbard today, and she purposely skipped over parts of her testimony because she's walking a fine line now. Now she has someone that actually is her direct report, right? In the same building, by the way, NCTC exists with GNI, reporting to her saying there was no imminent threat. And she's trying to figure out how she's going to navigate that dynamic when she's handling the president as the head of the intelligence community. So I also thought it was odd that she would take the line of like, oh, it's up to the president to decide that imminent threat. I'm like, no, it is your job, Tulsi. It is your job. And so I think one question that I have here in this whole situation is the top counterterrorism official in the Trump administration has just left his slot. That slot is vacant now while we are under severe threat from counterterrorism because of Iran. Here domestically, we're seeing it overseas. Americans are under threat overseas because of the actions of this administration that they've decided to take. And so now we have a void in this slot. So I think, while Joe Kent, look, I believe he was unqualified for the position.
What's his motivation here, you think?
So that's what I'm trying to figure out with him. Like, why this moment to speak out other than, okay, two things can be true, right? He's an extremist and qualified for the job, but also it can also be true that there was no imminent threat and he disagrees and felt like he wanted to come out and make this point of view made, like, publicly.
You already hear about cracks within MAGA. You heard someone yesterday saying that MAGA was dead, that the idea of Trump's America First strategy is not in line with his actions taken in this war. And you see this being vocalized. To look ahead for me as a strategist to the midterms and how this plays out, what do you see for Republicans?
Well, 80-something% of Republicans agree with the president's actions. So I think this MAGA thing is completely overblown. Yes, of course, you have the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, and now the Joe Kents who speak out against any intervention in any country, regardless of the threat they pose. That's always going to exist. But the fact that it's the idea that it's widespread is completely overblown. Look, this is clearly a different administration in terms of their foreign policy viewpoints than the first time around. And heavy is the head that wears the presidency. And the president needs to, just like Jefferson before him, and all preceding presidents, have to take the advice of everybody around them, but then finally come to a decision. Jefferson himself, he didn't want a standing army. Next thing you know, we're outfitting ships for Africa. The fact of the matter is, every president takes the incoming information and makes a decision they feel are best. Donald Trump does not want to be another one of the presidents who kicks the Iranian can down the road and believes that we can do it quickly. And what you're seeing in the Straits of Hormuz, what you're seeing with the attacks on their Gulf state partners, this is a telltale sign that I'm sure all the intelligence knew signaled the last throes of this regime. And he wants to make sure that he puts this to bed sooner rather than later.
The Middle East conflict, war there, impact here. The Bank of England holds interest rates. No surprise given the surge in gas prices across the UK and Europe after Iran struck a huge plant in Qatar, with With the conflict escalating, how will our economy cope with yet another shock and setback? Also this lunchtime, 7 new cases of meningitis investigated, including a student at a London college, all linked to the Kent outbreak, as more in Kent are told to get the vaccine.
We're keeping that situation under review. We may well expand eligibility for antibiotics and vaccination in the coming days, depending on what we see, and we'll take those decisions in an evidence-informed way.
1 dead, 1 missing. Police are continuing to search for a boy after a car carrying 5 teenagers crashed into the River Nene. And a royal right to roam, King Charles to open the world's longest coastal path.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Nina Hussain.
Good afternoon. The Bank of England has held interest rates at 3.75%. It's the latest sign of the impact the conflict in the Middle East will have on us here. It comes as the price of gas has risen sharply in the UK and Europe following attacks on Qatar's Ras Laffan energy complex. The US President Donald Trump has said the US would massively blow up the entirety of the world's largest gas field in Iran if it attacks Qatar again. It's threats like this that the bank will be taking into account when making decisions about interest rates over the coming months. Our economics editor, Joel Hills, is at the Bank of England for us this lunchtime. Joel, exactly what did the bank say?
Well, if in doubt, Nina, and let's be clear, the future looks extraordinarily uncertain at the moment, do nothing. And that's exactly what the Bank of England decided to do today. The Monetary Policy Committee, the men and women that set interest rates, voted unanimously to keep the cost of borrowing at 3.75%, warning that the war in the Gulf is causing inflation in the United Kingdom. It's putting upward pressure on prices across the board. Just last month, of course, everyone here in the city had a cut penciled in. The war has changed everything. Overnight, the price of UK natural gas has risen by 16%. That's the price that Ofgem uses to set the price cap on domestic energy bills. The price of oil on international markets has reached $116 a barrel just before the war. Before the first missile was fired, it was down at $72. And when the price of oil rises, the price of almost everything in an economy tends to rise too. War in the Middle East has pushed up global energy prices, says the Governor of Bank of England. You can already see that at the petrol pump, and if it lasts, it will feed into higher household energy bills later this year. The best way to tackle this, Andrew Bailey says, is at the source by reopening energy supply lines. The energy price shock is underway. The scale is unknowable, which is why the bank has voted to wait and see. We're seeing the ripple effects at the pumps. We're also seeing it in the housing market, of course. Lenders are repricing their loans to reflect their belief that interest rates will now have to be higher for longer.
Well, the rates are naturally increasing off the back of what's been going on in the global political arena. We've seen rates increase in the circa 0.75%, 0.75% over that period. Products are being withdrawn at little to no notice. So consumers and borrowers are having to make, prompt decisions to secure rates. But we are monitoring them as best we can.
That they've never seen before. We've demolished their Navy, their Air Force. All technology is gone. All communication is gone. And all of the leaders are gone. Other than that, they're doing quite well. Okay, how about one more question for the Prime Minister? Let me pick a beautiful looking person from Japan. A question for the Prime Minister. Go ahead. Yeah. Oh, he doesn't believe he's beautiful. Oh, okay. He's sounding shy.
People, of course, know Japan and US are very good friends. But one question: why didn't you tell US allies in Europe and Asia, like Japan, about the war before attacking Iran. So we are very confused about we Japanese citizens.
Well, one thing you don't want to signal too much, when we go in, we went in very hard and we didn't tell anybody about it because we wanted surprise. Who knows better about surprise than Japan? Okay. Why didn't you tell me about Pearl Harbor? Okay. Right? He's asking me, no, you believe in surprise, I think much more so than us. And we had to surprise him, and we did. And because of that surprise, we knocked out, the first 2 days, we probably knocked out 50% of what and much more than we anticipated doing. So if I go and tell everybody about it, there's no longer a surprise, right? Okay, one more for the Prime Minister.
Mr. President.
Are you good for the Prime Minister?
Yes,
Go ahead for the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much. Japan's TJ Press. Japan's biggest concern is China. Now they're giving us export control and very harsh terms to criticize us. So will you plan to bring up relationship between Japan and China while you are there?
Yeah. Well, I'll be going to China very quickly, but I think I'd really like to have the Prime Minister talk about China because I know they have a little bit of an edgy relationship, and I'd just like to know where it stands, how you're doing with China. So, please.
で日本はいつも中国に対してオープンです。会話はオープンにしています。それから冷静に対応しています。でとにかく米中関係も含めてですね、これが地域の安定、それから世界のサプライチェーン、これに貢献するものであることを願っています。日本は常にオープンです。
So first of all, Japan has been consistently open to dialogue with China. And also, second, we have been addressing our relations with China in a calm manner. And also, speaking of the US-China relationship, my sincere hope is that the relationship will be something conducive for regional security and also ensuring the global supply chain in the world. Once again, I would like to reiterate that Japan has been consistently open to dialogue with China.